Hi, welcome, and sorry to interrupt your conversations. Sunday afternoon is always a fun time to meet up with friends, either ones you've known for a long time or ones you were just meeting today. My name is Eric Hansen. I'm the music director and conductor of the Prometheus Symphony. And if you've come to our concerts before, one or many, or if you're a new audience member the first time, I give a talk, a spiel before the concert for a few minutes. And some of it is kind of gamey. I like to know that my audiences are kind of not just listening to me, but recognizing the difference between truth and falsehood. So I'll probably hide, I'm joking by the way, I'll probably hide some things in my talk that are not necessarily true. You might recognize some of them. Like for instance, if I start talking about baseball, I'm probably not talking about 19th century music. In any case, welcome to our concert, and my talk today is going to be kind of really intriguing for one very important reason, and that has to do with the chronology of the two composers that we're going to be performing music of today, and most importantly, the dates of the compositions. I don't believe I've ever played in or conducted a concert where all the music was actually composed the very same year, with the exception of when I was a graduate student, actually an undergrad at Cal and grad student at Michigan, where I played in the New Music Ensemble, and frequently the concerts were made up of compositions by graduate students who had just finished them. So, in this instance, the two pieces were composed in the year of 1841, and that is the Les Nuits d'été of Hector Berlioz and the Symphony No. 4 of Robert Schumann. The two composers, of course, are mid-century composers, if you want to call that, pretty much active from the teens or 20s all the way up to Berlioz lived into the 1860s. Schumann died in 1856, but so they were mid-century, which means they were in the, if you will, fairly early on in the vanguard of the Romantic era. And if you study your music or know your music, that even though kind of titles of eras are problematic, the classical, so-called classical era, as opposed to just classical music, the music of Haydn and Mozart and early Beethoven begins pretty much with the sons of Bach around the 1750s and other composers of that era in Europe, and runs pretty much up to Beethoven. And Beethoven is the great, if you will, person who kind of morphs early in his career from high classical, not sounding like Haydn or Mozart, but creating compositions that are based on structures and whatnot, and all the fundaments of this music of the second half of the 18th century, and then kind of pushes things into the beginnings of the Romantic era. And if you study literature, you know, of course, Romantic poetry begins earlier than music. Music tends to kind of lag behind literature stylistically. Nevertheless, our two composers are Romantic era composers, and they have a number of similarities, as you would expect, Romantic music being what it is, even if you're a piece that is not austere per se, but not composed with some type of a program idea related to a play or a story or a storyline. Nevertheless, the music has an ebb and flow that you would expect of music that's of the Romantic nature. And so these two composers in particular are very dynamic composers, really two of the most important mid-century composers. And I just wanted to touch on some of their differences as well as some of their similarities. They both, like, I wouldn't say all of, but certainly quite a few of the Romantic era composers, unless someone was primarily liturgical / choral vocal composer who just wrote specifically for church. The two of these composed really a wide range of styles, all the way from, as I mentioned, liturgical music through to chamber music for small groups, and then on to larger ensembles, most notably orchestral music, and necessarily of a symphonic nature. Where they differed was that Schumann was very much, if you will, cerebral is not the right term, but he was very much an introspective composer, and he tended to think not so much in minutiae or in details, so much as constructing even large compositions with, not in a jigsaw way, but necessarily in a way that was, pieces were made up of a lot of elements. Whereas Berlioz was prone to very large sweeping gestures in his music, and it didn't matter if it was sort of small ensemble, although he didn't write a lot of small chamber music, very little actually. Berlioz substantively wrote for voice and orchestra or orchestra alone in large-scale works. For instance, he only wrote really one piece that he called Symphony. He did write a wind piece that was titled Symphony, but for a band, but basically the Symphonie Fantastique. And it's a very unique piece. It's very dramatic in nature and quite long. Whereas Schumann, in his four symphonies, adhered very much to the traditions that had been set up for constructing structures and uses of instruments, instrumentation, in other words, what instruments you use, based on the works of Haydn and Mozart, and especially early Beethoven, but even later Beethoven. So they're very, very different in their large forms. And the two pieces we're playing today are actually a really good example, if you were to pick one piece by either of these composers, for a wide range of different aspects of what was in play in the middle part of the 19th century for composers who were major / significant composers. You'll notice with the Berlioz that even though, as I mentioned a moment ago, he liked to use very large groups of instruments, huge orchestras with multiple instruments in the woodwinds as well as the brasses, and he enjoyed music that was very, very loud and dynamic, that would swell up like a gigantic wave and then just fall back down to nothing. He was particularly good at these large, if you will, large gestures, so typical of his personality, which was very emotive. He was prone to being like an over-the-top, very aggressive, outgoing person. He almost, I hate to use the term stalk because it's a scary word, but when he first saw his first wife, Harriet Smithson, who was an English Shakespearean actor, visiting, hello, all right, visiting Paris, where the Parisians got an opportunity in the 1820s to observe for the first time Shakespeare. Berlioz was overcome when he saw this great actor, Harriet Smithson, and he basically became like a puppy dog, following her around until she married him. So his gestures and music necessarily duplicate that kind of wonderful, evocative outgoingness, if you want to call it aggressiveness. Nevertheless, this work we're playing today is scored for a chamber orchestra of just half dozen 7 or 8 woodwinds and 3 horns. It's very delicate for the most part, and that might be just because the tradition in French song is to have a kind of a light, frothy a background that supports the vocalist. Even though it's a substantive work, it's as long or longer, if you will, in the 6 songs as the Schumann. Whereas the Schumann uses a very traditional, as I mentioned, late Beethoven orchestra of pairs of woodwinds, 4 horns, and 3 trombones, although the trombones play very light and just a traditional timpani. Schumann constructs in such a way that his music is almost, if you listen to it, even the long pieces, and he wrote several pieces for solo piano that run 30, 40 minutes long, but they don't have the typical first movement fast with a couple of melodies that are developed, slow movement, slow, romantic, lyrical, with a couple of melodies, and a third movement fast. Schumann tends to use a construct that's like a long necklace that has a lot of very, very different items on it, like a Berkeley therapist would wear. So I mean, not clunky, excuse me. I'm sorry, I apologize if you're a therapist and you don't wear that. But in any case, the analogy is apt. So the Schumann, even the substantive movements you're going to hear of 10 minutes long, are going to be made up of little increments, elements, kernels of melody that fit together in a rather elaborate and not necessarily introspective way, so much as a complicated way, like a string, like a necklace. Thank you. I have this effect on microphones and people at times. Whereas so the interesting thing here is you have this tremendous contrast between these two pieces that were composed in the same year, but from very, very different personalities who basically, I wouldn't say imbued the works with their personality, but how can you separate a composer with his or her composition? The final thing I wanted to mention about the works, very importantly, both of these men were very heavily influenced in their lives, or I should say supported, but also at least with Schumann in a collaborative way, with women, very strong women. I mentioned Berlioz' Harriet Smithson. Even though their marriage didn't last long, he was very heavily influenced by observing her in Shakespeare and wrote a number of works based on Shakespeare that are very powerful and very dynamic. And with Schumann, his wife of a number of years, Clara Wieck, was an incredible musician, and if she were alive today, she would be a major composer, but as we all know, 19th century Europe, there are a number of compositions that are very fine song cycles, and she was a superb pianist, and they played often together four hands. So two very interesting characters and dynamic pieces. I'll talk briefly, very briefly about them before we start each one. Finally, before the concert begins, I want to mention a note of sadness. One of our members died suddenly last month. It was a big shock to us and his family and friends. Craig Kronman was a violist in the orchestra who played actually since the time I started conducting the orchestra 25 years ago. He was, I could talk about him for a long time, even though he was not a noisy person by a long shot, except for maybe when he was playing viola. He was a very, I guess like Schumann in many ways, he was kind of an introspective person. I had several really fine conversations with him. He was a very warm, caring person, and who loved chamber music. He played string quartets throughout his career and played with us, as I mentioned, for 25 years. And it was a huge shock to us, and I know to his family our heartfelt thanks that we had an opportunity to share a lot of really good times with him. I had a number of brief conversations with him. I found him to have, this is me, I don't mean to talk about me, but to have the most important of all qualities, intellectual curiosity, and I don't mean that in a mean or superior way. He was very thoughtful about music, and I know in his career, in his calling as an estate attorney, he was very caring and partnering all his clients through sometimes very difficult processes. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, and we're in fact dedicating this concert to Craig. Thank you.